To restore order in Cuba and Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War, and to protect American investments, President McKinley set up military governments on each island. McKinley appointed Leonard Wood as governor of Cuba in 1899. Wood oversaw the drafting of a new Cuban constitution in 1901. In order to ensure that other imperialist nations would not take control of Cuba and to preserve American business interests, the U.S. forced Cuba to include the Platt Amendment within Cuba's new constitution. This amendment limited Cuba's ability to sign treaties with other nations. It also gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, required Cuba to sell or lease land to the U.S. for naval and coaling stations, and led to the establishment of a U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. This amendment made Cuba a U.S. protectorate, which is a country under the control and protection of another country. After the amendment, U.S. troops left Cuba. The amendment was eventually repealed, but the U.S. kept its lease on Guantanamo Bay. Puerto Rico did not become a protectorate. Instead, it was governed as a U.S. territory just like the Philippines. The Foraker Act of 1900 stated that the U.S. would appoint Puerto Rico's governor and the upper house of its legislature. Puerto Rican voters would elect the lower house. In 1917, a law granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans and allowed Puerto Rican voters to elect all of their legislative representatives. In 1952, Puerto Rico became a self-governing commonwealth of the United States. Today, the U.S. government still controls certain aspects of Puerto Rico, even though it has control over its own domestic affairs. The U.S. controls interstate trade, immigration, and military affairs, just as it does for U.S. states. The Panama Canal started as a dream of a faster way to move between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without having to travel around South America. In the 1880s, a French company tried to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, which was part of Colombia. The company went bankrupt, and in 1902, the United States bought the rights to the operation. Secretary of State John Hay began negotiations with Colombia, but Colombia refused to ratify the treaty. President Theodore Roosevelt supported Panamanian revolutionaries who wanted to break free from Colombia, and the United States recognized the Republic of Panama. This got the U.S. their treaty and the rights to build the canal. Work on the canal began in May of 1904. Harsh working conditions, shortages of labor and materials, and outbreaks of yellow fever and malaria all hampered construction efforts. Roosevelt appointed John F. Stevens as chief engineer to get the project back on track. After some improvements, Stevens resigned, and Lieutenant Colonel George W. Goethals continued the task of construction. His efforts led him to be called the genius of the Panama Canal. Up to 44,000 workers, many from the British West Indies, labored on the project at a time. In August of 1914, the SS Enkin became the first ship to pass officially through the Panama Canal. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in 1823, declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to further colonization by European nations. Although not enforced, presidents began to back it up after the Spanish-American War to protect American economic interests in Latin America. In 1904, when the Dominican Republic was unable to repay a loan to its European lenders, Roosevelt issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It said that the United States pledged to use armed forces to prevent any European country from seizing Dominican territory. This declaration brought stability to the region and kept other nations out, but it made Latin Americans uneasy that the United States was so willing to use police power. During the presidency of William H. Taft, U.S. influence in Latin America deepened. Taft believed in advancing U.S. interests in other countries through dollar diplomacy. This was a policy of promoting American economic interests in other countries and using that economic power to achieve American policy goals. Taft suggested that the United States buy out European loans to Latin America. By paying off Latin American countries, they now owed the U.S. This added to Latin Americans' uneasiness and distrust of the United States. President Woodrow Wilson rejected dollar diplomacy for moral diplomacy. He felt that the use of persuasion and American ideals would advance the U.S. interests abroad. However, he still had to deal with civil unrest in both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where United States Marines occupied the countries for years. Dictator Porfirio Diaz brought order as ruler of Mexico. However, his rule was oppressive, did not permit freedom of the press, and used the army to maintain peace at any cost. Diaz also got money from foreign investors, including the United States. This helped to modernize Mexico quickly, but the wealth was placed in the hands of foreign investors and a small Mexican elite, leaving most Mexicans poor. In 1910, Porfirio Diaz ran for re-election and controlled every aspect of the election. He jailed his opponent, Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner, and said that he earned fewer than 200 votes, while Diaz earned 1,000,000 votes. When released from jail, Madero fled to Texas and declared himself President of Mexico. Upon his return to Mexico, he found rebels already active. The Mexican Revolution became a series of uprisings in different parts of the country. In the South, Emiliano Zapata and his army of Native American peasants known as Zapatistas wanted land returned to the natives. In the North, Francisco Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco led a large revolt against Diaz. In May of 1911, Diaz resigned and was exiled to France. In November of 1911, Francisco Madero was elected President of Mexico, and he tried to establish a democratic government. He faced challenges from all sides. The commander of the government troops, Victoriano Huerta, overthrew Madero in 1913, imprisoned him, and had him executed. The United States and President Wilson did not recognize the government of Huerta, considering him an assassin with no legitimate claim to power. Wilson authorized weapon sales to Huerta's enemies and followed a policy of watchful waiting. On April 9, 1914, 9 crew members of the USS Dolphin went ashore for supplies in the Mexican port of Tampico. They were arrested by soldiers loyal to Huerta, but were quickly released unharmed, and Mexican officials apologized. U.S. Admiral Henry Mayo demanded more, like giving the American flag a 21-gun salute within 24 hours. Huerta refused, and because of this incident, Wilson asked Congress to authorize the use of armed forces against Mexico. The Battle of Veracruz followed, when Wilson learned of a German ship heading for the Mexican port city of Veracruz loaded with weapons for Huerta. The U.S. Navy and Marines attempted to seize the city with little bloodshed, but were met with gunfire. 17 Americans and some 300 Mexicans died. U.S. troops occupied the city for the next 6 months, and finally, mediators from Argentina, Brazil, and Chile called for the resignation of Huerta. After Huerta fled Mexico, the U.S. supported Venustiano Carranza as the next leader. However, there were still Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata competing for power. Pancho Villa retaliated with violence, crossing the U.S. border and burning the small town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 Americans. This was the first armed invasion of the continental United States since the War of 1812. Wilson ordered a military expedition led by General John J. Pershing and 10,000 U.S. troops into Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa. After 11 months, they were unsuccessful. As troops remained in Mexico, the threat of war and tensions remained. With the focus on World War I and Europe, Wilson called off the search for Pancho Villa and withdrew U.S. troops from Mexico. In December 1916, Carranza called a constitutional convention, and the new constitution contained the ideas of all the revolutionary groups. Despite this new constitution, fighting continued until 1920, and the economy was destroyed. Many Mexicans immigrated to the United States in search of a more stable life.